All right. Hey, good morning, everybody. Happy New Year. All right. Welcome back. Those of you online, thanks for joining us. Some of you are live, some of you are watching the replay, but however, we're glad to have you. Welcome to New Year. Hope you had a Christ-filled Christmas and some good time, maybe some good rest. Holidays, I don't have to tell you, can be hectic sometimes, but we had a wonderful time. We have a new, as you know, a new grandbaby, so spend a lot of time there helping our youngest son with the newborn and with the 3-year-old. So it's been great. A few updates. Let's see. Trying to remember Nora Patterson. Nora and her husband are not here today. Nora's dad passed away, her biological father, I don't know, a couple of days ago, and I got word of that. So I want to pray for Nora and Louis. Though Nora is not that close to her biological dad, her sister is very close. So it's kind of been a difficult time. And then John, kind of wave your hand there if you don't mind. John and Andrea have been so faithful here for so many years. Andy passed away, kind of suddenly on the 29th. The celebration service was Friday morning, what have you, and just kind of sad, to be honest with you, and what have you. But John, thank you for buddy getting up and coming in and continuing the routine, because I remember the last time 3 weeks ago I looked over there and you and Andy sitting right there together. Just reminded again how fragile life really is. Cherish the relationships. You never know when they're not going to end. So appreciate it. And then I wanted to give you an update on the missionary couple, the Morgans, that Charlotte helped me become aware of several weeks ago, and that she's got ALS and Alzheimer's kind of together. Just a wonderful couple from Ohio. I don't know them personally, strong believers. And Charlotte got connected with them because of the Alzheimer's. They had reached out somehow to Brother Jim, and she helped Brother Jim in that area. But nonetheless, they had really a financial need to provide the care that she needed in this end of lifetime. And when I reported to you a few weeks ago, we were about halfway to a $30,000 goal. And I mentioned it to you, and so many of you kind of jumped in, and John is so grateful for your help. We're at, I think, 26,000 of the 30 that they need, and it was 15 3 weeks ago. And I looked down the list, and a lot of folks do anonymous, and I respect that. But I saw a lot of names sitting here that I know that gifted. So thank you. Almost home. She's not terminal, if that makes sense. The doctor just said, just even recently, probably talking months, but not years. But will continue to deteriorate because of ALS and the Alzheimer's together. She still has recognition, still goes to church, but can't speak at this point and what have you. But a wonderful couple that I know I won't get a chance to meet here, but I will there in glory. But thanks for being the body of Christ and reaching out and helping these people. I know it means a lot to them. And then I don't want to embarrass him, but Michael, wave your hand. All right, Michael. Michael and I met. We have a common love, golf, and we met months ago. And he's a retired pastor, 30-something years in Maryland. And they moved down here to get closer to family. And we just met and just really hit it off. And they live about 30, 45 minutes south of here. And I've been inviting him to come, though it's not convenient. And he texted me last night and said he was going to show up today. And sure enough, he did. So part of his judgment was to sit at the table with Jerry Johnson. Okay. On it. So, Michael, I'm honored, brother. Thank you so much for coming and for being here. Okay. Hey, here's my email. I know we have some guests this morning, a number of you, and we're so glad that you're here. Please take a picture or write down my email and just shoot me an email so I'll have a chance to kind of get connected with you. I promise you I will respond. I won't ignore it. And if you get it to me today, I'll respond today on you and just thank you for coming and what have you. And let me say, those of you that are guests, you can sit wherever you want to sit. So if you're sitting at a table today and they're mean and nasty, okay. Don't tell me I've tried to change them for years. They're not going to change, okay? So just go find another table, okay? And eventually, but after 3, if you don't find one, just don't come back. It's hopeless. It's hopeless. But shoot me an email here. And then for those of you that are involved in social media, next slide, please. Social media. Here's how to get a hold of us on Journey through Facebook. And then the classes, for those of you that are new, all of the teachings are live right now. And then immediately they're uploaded to Facebook. And you can find them there. Just go to Facebook and go to YouTube, and type in my name, and boom. I think there are about 400 teachings there. So if you're bored, you need something, you can listen to those. But this will be uploaded within minutes. After we conclude this morning. And I'd encourage you to subscribe. So every time there's a new posting, you'll be able to get it. Okay. And next slide, Monty, if you would. I had planned probably now 6 weeks ago that when we came to the first of this year, I was going to begin a study in the book of James. And I'm still going to do that, though I'm not going to begin that until probably the first Sunday in February. I just kept keeping an eye on what was going on really in the Mideast with Israel, and know that that's important historically and prophetically. And the more I looked at it and just kind of prayed about it, I felt like that I needed to say something about it to the class. And then the more I got into it over the last 3 weeks, one lesson became 2, became 3. And right now it's 3. Okay, I'm not sure. I just have read a lot of surveys and I guess you could say a USA support of Israel, and our support over the last 25 years. Though we are Israel's strongest allies still, but our commitment to Israel is waning and has been waning since the early 90s, even though we're still the strongest ally. And I think it's especially true in the 40 and under, but I'm not sure it's not somewhat true in the 40 and older, is I think we either never knew or we forgot the story of Israel. And it's a story that we need to know and that we need to understand because it has great implications for globally, and it has great implications for us as a nation. And I'm afraid that we've either forgotten that or we never do it in the first place. So the next few weeks, I'm going to address this subject of Israel. Next week, we'll look at really the beginning of the nation of Israel and kind of walk through to where things are in the present, and then prophetically moving forward. And then the next week, I'm going to talk about Israel, America, and the church, and what role, if any, does America play as it relates to Israel, and then what role does the church play in moving forward, and what are all the implications there? And then that third week, we're going to look more specifically at Hamas, its history, and what happened on October 7th, a little bit, not a lot. And then look at Israel, and then end times as well. So that's kind of where we're going over the next few weeks. I told Lena, I said, I don't know that I have spent this much time on anything. I probably, over this last 3 weeks, because I had a lot of white space, I probably spent 25 to 30 hours a week just on these teachings to get ready for that, because there's so much information, and to try to distill it down into a time frame that we can meet in here and still have time for discussion. So, I'm soliciting your prayers, but we'll spend 2, 3, 4 weeks on this series, and then I'll pick up with a series in James moving forward. But I sent an email, or Kathy did in my behalf, went out yesterday, and hopefully, you got it. But if you didn't, and you're not on our email list, then what you need to do is Kathy, kind of wave your hand, but if you will just email Kathy Lombard, that's with a C and not a K, and it's with an I, not a Y. Okay? CATHI Lumbert, LUMBERT @gmail.com. And I'll try to remember maybe to put that up there next week. Then we'll get you on the email list so you'll know what's going on. But I included in there where I was going for the next few weeks in the teaching. Okay, but for today, we're going to begin to look at my word for the year. And I hope that you've gotten your word or get one. Tom was asking me this morning because I had told Tom privately a few weeks ago that I've been doing this for 16, 17 years. And it seemed like when it started, I'd get a word and it would last 12 months. And then the next year, 11 months. And the next year, 10 months. The next year, 9 months. And it just kind of seems like the last few years I get a word. But after about 3 months, I've got to think to remember what it is. Okay, and I wish I could tell you there was an aging issue. It wasn't. It just I hadn't locked in on it. So I had really planned not to get a word and not to say anything to you about it. Just to kind of move into the year. And right around Thanksgiving, it was just one of those uneasy times when God spoke to me and He said, "Hey, Jimmy, here's your word for 2024. And I kind of raised my hand and I said, "But I don't have a word for 2024. And God whispered in my ear, "You do now. And this is your word." So hopefully it'll last more than a few days or a few weeks. Last year my word was focus, and I lost focus by Easter. That's terrible to admit, but it was true. The year before was one of my best years ever, because I remember it was patience, and Lord knows I need patience, a lot of it. But it was a game changer for me in terms of my relationship, especially with Linda, and being more patient. And this past year, you may remember we did I did two or three things on slowing down and not being in a hurry in life. And kind of a combination of those two things is my world looks radically different than it did some time ago in terms of being more patient and less hurried. And life's at a good pace. It really is, and I'm grateful for that. Okay, so I want to begin really with a couple of questions for you. They're really going to be two sets of questions. The first two are going to be more related to others, not to you specifically. Then I have two for you. Okay, so here's the first one. Who knows a discontented person? In other words, when you're around them, they're just kind of always, maybe not always, but too often, they're critical, they're negative, they're griping, they're murmuring, they're grumbling, they're complaining person. Raise your hand if you know someone like that. Okay. Hopefully it's not a mate. Hopefully it's not a child or a parent or a coworker or a good friend, but the chances are it is. Okay, so this is my next question. How do they make you feel when they start their griping, complaining, and discontentment? Okay, a little frustrated maybe sometimes, maybe a little agitated sometimes, but all too often almost jumping on the bandwagon. Yeah, you're right. Yeah. Life's not fair, I understand, and we kind of jump on their bandwagon. Now I've got two questions for you. On a scale of 1 to 10, 10 being off the chart, rate your discontentment. Just get a number in your head. On a scale of 1 to 10, rate your discontentment. Is it low, under 5? Is it 5, 6, 7, or is it up there at 9, 10? Where is it? Okay? And then my next question is, what would give you more contentment? What would give you? I mean, if you couldn't say 10 was your number, and I doubt if anybody did. And now I'm asking you, well, then what would raise the number? What would move you toward 10? What would move you from 5 to 6? What would move you up? More what? because it's almost always more. More something. More time, more health, more money, more house, more car, more peace, always more of something. Always more. Well, I don't know that this is true, because I suspect since the fall, we have always lived in times of discontentment. That may be just part of the nature of our fallenness on it. But at least to me, it just feels, Lynn and I went to the mall yesterday. She wanted to pick up something, and I just love going to the mall for not to buy, and I like walking around. I get my coffee, but I like watching people. And this is not a happy world. Looking at the faces, the countenance of so many people, it just seems like life was a burden, and being maybe wherever they were, they didn't want to be there. Just a real sense, as it were, of discontent. It just seems so very few are satisfied with something in their life at all. And the more I began to think about that in my word, you probably figured it out by now, in getting into my word for the year, the more I realize not only is this not new, I think I can take us all the way back to the Garden of Eden and to Adam and Eve. I mean, think for a minute. God created Adam and then Eve, placed them in a culture he called paradise, gave them anything and everything they could ever need or want, would come and personally, however that happened, walk with them in the garden in the cool of the day, somehow carrying on some kind of a conversation and giving them really open access to anything and everything except one tree in the midst of the garden. Now, how long they were in that situation, I don't know. All I know is that they were in a perfect paradise for an extended period of time and became discontented. So if your answer, what would it take for you to be more content? What would it take? The answer is you can't get there in this world. Because even when God had Adam and Eve in a perfect paradise, they became discontented. So it's a genuine issue, really, for all of us. I'm reminded, and it's a very interesting, most of us know the story of David. And how God had called him, out of the family to become a king. And then second chapter of Samuel, in chapter 11, after his, this is a guy. This is a handsome musician, military leader. I think anything that a male could want, had access, at least in that culture, to just about any and every woman. And he saw this woman, Bathsheba, and he wanted her, and basically had her husband killed in order to have her. And after that experience, you know the story, Nathan confronts him. But I want you to listen. Here's a guy that had everything. Nathan said to David, "You are the man." He just described the situation, and David said, "Whoever did that, I would take care of him." David was angry, and Nathan says, "That man is you. Thus says the Lord, the God of Israel. Listen, I anointed you king over Israel. I delivered you out of the hand of Saul." We all know the story, how many times Saul tried to kill him. "I gave you your master's house and your master's wives into your bosom. And I gave you the house of Israel and of Judah. And if this were too little, I would add to you as much more as you asked. And yet, much like Adam and Eve and us, he was discontented. He was discontented. So that's the world that you and I live in. So my word for this year is contentment. Contentment. Understanding the tension that I'll never fully arrive at it. But if I do have a few moments here and there when I live in it, it's probably not going to last because of me and my fallenness and my own personal humanness. Now, I thought, what can I do to give you a picture, the image of contentment? So I came up with this one. Is that not a picture of true contentment? That's our newest granddaughter, Danielle or Danny, that we're spending so much time with in these days. But there's a good image, as it were, of contentment. Okay. Hey, open your Bibles to or your device to the book of Philippians. The book of Philippians, and find chapter 4. Chapter 4. This is my text for addressing this issue of contentment. I'm going to begin reading in verse 10. I'm going to really address verses 10 to 20, but I'm only going to read a portion of that for the sake of time. Let me remind you, Paul wrote 13, just one short of half of the books we have in the New Testament. 4 of those he wrote while imprisoned for getting the gospel out. Galatians, Ephesians, Philippians, and Colossians. So Paul is in prison as he writes this letter to the church in Philippi. So just keep that in mind. I rejoice greatly in the Lord that at last you have renewed your concern for me. Indeed, you have been concerned, but you had no opportunity to show it. I'm not saying this because I'm in need, for I have learned to be content whatever the circumstances. I know what it is to be in need, and I know what it is to have plenty. I have learned the secret of being content in any and every situation, whether well-fed or hungry, whether living in plenty or in want. I can do everything through him who gives me strength. And then let me slip down to verse 19. And my God will meet all your needs according to his riches in Christ Jesus. I believe that this church at Philippi was Paul's favorite church. I do. He stayed there a long time. He had good, successful ministry there with them. And evidently, unlike most of the other churches that he founded on his journeys, this was a church that just always seemed to step up and meet his needs. They were always there for him, whether it's to pray for him or to meet the financial need. And the financial needs in that world, but especially in Palestine area, tremendous famine, tremendous hunger, tremendous needs, hard to find work. This was the world in which Paul was journeying. And it was especially true in Palestine. The need was great. And part of the reason I think Paul founded these churches and reached out, many of them being primarily Gentile, was to bring what began really as a Jewish faith in Jesus and to become more inclusive with the Gentiles. And one of the best ways to bring folks that really don't care for each other, to bring them together, is to have one meet the needs of the other. So Paul spends so much of his journeys collecting what was called a relief offering to take back to the struggling Jewish Christians, primarily in Jerusalem, to help them make their way through famine and through the difficulties in the time. And it seemed to have worked really, really well. But the church at Philippi was not without its issues like any other church. This was the only church that Paul specifically said to them, do all things without grumblings and murmurings. Contentment. Do all things without grumbling and murmuring. This was such a serious sin, if you know your Old Testament, especially in Numbers, when the people of Israel were making their pilgrimage from Egypt and slavery and making their way into the promised land. God provided them. He provided them a cloud and fire to guide them and to lead them. But He also provided, because largely they were in the wilderness and the desert, God would provide for, as it were, their water and their nourishment needs. And He would provide quail, or He would provide manna for them fresh every day. But if you know the story, okay, they became discontented. They wanted to go back to Egypt, wanted to go back to slavery. And God had been providing miraculously for their needs. And God, in His infinite, frightening holiness, killed, I think it was 23,000 of them for grumbling. Why aren't we all dead? So this is a serious issue that really, doesn't need to be taken, lightly. Matthew 11:6, I call the missing beatitude. We all are familiar with blessed are the poor in spirit, blessed, blessed, blessed. But there are two more that are found elsewhere. One in Matthew 11:6 and one in Acts 20 is more blessed to give than to receive. But when Jesus is basically responding to a report that He gets from some of His disciples who had gone to visit John the Baptist, who was in prison, when they return and give a report, and John's a little down in the mouth, a little discontented, a little grumbling and griping about, listen, I've given my life to be, as it were, the forerunner for you, and now I find myself in a prison in the middle of the desert, probably going to lose my head, which he did. And I just want to know, are you the Messiah or not? Are you the real deal or not? Or am I wasting my life here? And Jesus' response when His disciples returned to Him from that visit to John was this: blessed is a man who takes no offense in me. Which translated is, I will bless the person who will let me run their life and not be discontented with how I'm doing it. I will bless that person. So when we come to this, my word of contentment, let me begin by giving you a definition. It's found, by the way, you may not have caught it, but I have learned to be content, and I have learned the secret of being content. It's mentioned 2 times. Now, what's interesting, those are the only 2 times it's ever mentioned. The only 2 times it's mentioned. And it simply means enough. It means enough. That's all it means. But here would be a good working. We are content. We are content when we are satisfied with whatever God provides. When we are satisfied with whatever God provides. What comes to your mind when you think of that definition in your own journey? Are you satisfied with what God has provided? Well, how do you know? The simplest answer I can give to you to tell you whether or not you are content or satisfied with what God has provided. Do you, for the most part, day in and day out, live with a sense of peace and calm and serenity rather than with an attitude of anxiousness, stressed out and burned out and frustrated with life? Which of those more often describe your day-by-day attitudes? More at peace or more stressed out with whatever life has bringing you? Now, I want to point out, before I get into the sources of contentment, because I really think this is important here. Paul says finding contentment Finding it is a secret that must be learned. Maybe the reason we don't experience more contentment is that we've not learned the secret. Now, learn insinuates that it's not natural. It's part of the process of life experiences. But we all have life experiences, so if it's not been learned, then obviously if we've not learned the secret, then we've not rightly processed life experiences. And the second thing, which is a little bit of an enigma to me, is that he calls it a secret. Do you know how many other times Paul has used the word secret? 0. This is it. Paul says, I've discovered a secret to learn contentment. Now, a secret means mysterious. It means got to look for it. Means can be hard to find and discover. And I found that true in, 40, 50 years of being a Christian, and many of that being being a pastor, because I've heard it all. I've met with single people. My first responsibility to come here many, many years ago was the single adult pastor. And I spent hours and hours meeting with single women and single men whose only goal in life was to get married. Then I hung around long enough after no longer dealing with the singles and moving into other responsibilities, which largely included marriage. And I had enough breakfasts and lunches with marrieds, especially men, who now they were married and they wish they were single. I've heard parents who want their kids to show emotional maturity and stability. And they grow up and they begin to show that later in life, it seems, but they begin to show that. And we find ourselves saying, at least Len and I do, okay, do you ever miss the younger years with the kids? And the answer is yes. So it's almost like contentment depends on who you're talking to. And what used to make us content doesn't make us content anymore. What makes us content now didn't make us content back there. It's elusive. It's hard to grasp. Well, I think in these verses, Paul helps us to see, as it were, some of the sources of contentment to help us to learn the secret of contentment, which hopefully will help me to maybe to live out my word a little bit more this year than in the past. So listen up, pay attention, because at the end of the lesson, there will be a test. Okay, so pay attention, okay? Don't nerd out or go to sleep, okay? All right, so I think there are 5. I'm going to look at 5 sources of contentment that are right here in the text. First, and again, not necessarily in order, to be content, discover this secret that is by learning from life's experiences. The first thing that I see in here is there has to be a confidence in God's providence. God's providence. Providence means the best definition of this would be protective care. Contentment never comes unless you and I, as followers of Christ, are confident in God's protective care, that He is there for us. To give you a little bit of background and context, it's been 10 years when Paul writes this from a prison. It's been 10 years, a decade, since Paul last was in Philippi. He visited there on his second missionary journey, a journey which covered largely by foot a little bit by boat, over 3,000 miles in that day and time. Lasted 2.5 years. That just his second journey. When Paul crossed the Aegean Sea from Asia Minor into Macedonia and Greece, in that area, the second place he ended up in was in Philippi. And there is where he established a church. He met Lydia, the seller of purple, who I think was the primary financier of the church there. And then that's where Paul was imprisoned. And he and Silas are singing at midnight, and jailer, we know the story there. And then he moves on to Berea and Thessalonica and other cities. And it appears as he moves on, the Philippian church continued to reach out to him and continue to meet his needs, probably financially, in order to continue, because he had kind of walked away from his vocation of making tents in order to do what God had called him to do, but he needed support to do that. And the Philippians were a church that helped him in that, as did, by the way, the church at Corinth as well. But for some reason, once he left Corinth and sailed really back to across the Mediterranean back to Palestine, for some reason they stopped sending, and we don't know why. It could have been, again, they didn't have 5 iPhones, they didn't have Instagram, they didn't have a way to stay with each other. And when Paul left Greece and Corinth and made his way, as it were, back home, they lost touch. Maybe they ran out of resources because the famine was also difficult in that area as well. But for whatever reason, they had not, for at least a decade, Paul had really not heard anything from them. And now Epaphroditus shows up with a gift. And Paul, verse 10 says, Paul rejoiced greatly. I love that phrase, rejoiced greatly. And to me, again, the source here is confidence in God's providence. Paul was confident, and that confidence brought him contentment that God knew his needs and that God had a supplier of his needs out there, not fully sure who that would be and where that would come from, but he was so confident in God's protective, providential care in his life. And he trusted him so much that he knew at the right time, through the right vehicle, that God would provide for his needs. And now it happened. And I doubt that he suspected that it would happen while he was imprisoned. But that's when it happened. They show up to help him meet his financial needs. And Paul was just so great. How they found out where Paul was, I don't know. We're not told. We just know that for 10 years there'd been silence, and now Epaphroditus shows up at a Mamertine prison and saying, "Hey, I got a gift. Remember the church at Philippi? They have renewed their love for you." Paul was just confident, and that's got to be there. And it has only come when you and I learn experience, look back over life, and realize how many times through life's experience that God's protective care, his providential watching over each one of us, met us sometimes when we least expected it, and often in ways we never expected it, but he came through. Maybe not when we wanted him to or how we wanted him to, but he came through. And our lives, and there's not an exception in here, are splattered by those incidences. Granted, along the way, there were also incidents when we waited and trusted and hoped and believed that God would provide, and it doesn't appear that he did. Life is a mixture of those. But I'll guarantee you, if you sit down with a legal pad and you look back over your journey and you write down the number of times that God came through versus the few times that he didn't, this wins. And I'm afraid sometimes the devil deceives us into thinking that God doesn't come through very often. Now, his track record's pretty good in coming through in all of our lives. So Paul really leaned on this providential care. Now it's interesting, if you look at your as how the books in the New Testament are written. Paul wrote Romans about 5 years before he writes this letter to the church at Philippi. And I did a teaching just before we took a break on Romans 8:28. Do all things work together for good. Okay, this is the same Paul now writing to the church at Philippi, who is again living out, yes, they do. God does take care of those who love him and are called according to his purpose. He may not do it in the way that we want him to do it, but he knows better. And he may not do it in the when we want him to do it, but he knows when. And we'll never have contentment until we become confident in God's providential care. Second, we'll never be contented until we become satisfied with God's provision. Satisfied with God's provision. The need for more, this is me, the need for more is the number one value in our culture. The need for more, of whatever, the need for more. A culture with this value is not sustainable. It breeds selfishness and envy and jealousy. It breeds discontentment. It breeds antagonism. It breeds theft, burglary, stealing, wars. It breeds all of that. Wanting more and more. Paul was just content with what God had provided him, and he was okay when he had little, and he was okay when he had a lot, and everywhere in between. He was satisfied, which was the very definition of contentment, is being satisfied with whatever God provides whenever God provides it. And he was satisfied with that. Now, there's a big difference, and I know it, between our needs and our wants. God never promised to satisfy our wants, but he did promise to satisfy our needs. You got to be satisfied with God's provision. So that kind of goes back to the second question that I asked you. What would it take for you to become more contented? And no matter how you answer that, let me speak the voice of a prophet into your journey. You will never be contented. No matter how you answer that, you'll never be contented. The third source, and that is contentment is independent of circumstances. Where is Paul? Prison. Just keep that in mind. Now, I want you to look at two phrases, especially in verses 11 and 12. Look at two phrases. Look in verse 11. I have learned to be content. Notice, whatever the circumstances. Really? Really? Next verse. I have learned the secret of being content in any and every situation. Really? Every circumstance, any and every situation. Why? Because Paul knew any contentment that relies on circumstances will never last. Because circumstances change. Now, I don't think Paul is saying, let's be so spiritual that we'll be indifferent to the circumstances of life. No. Because some of the circumstances of life, no matter how much you try, you'll never be indifferent to them. They've been life-changing. But there's a difference. And I think it's a big difference in being indifferent to them and not being controlled by them. And too often, you and I are responsive to the circumstances of life. And those control our decisions. God is providential, caring for us. Anything and everything that happens to us, all things work together for good. That's the good, the bad, the ugly, and the evil. To those who love God and called according to his purpose. God sees it, and God knows it, and God can provide and step in. Our circumstances should never determine our contentment. Ever. And Paul knew that and experienced so much. In Proverbs chapter 30, just thought this connected here. Proverbs 30 verses 8 and 9. The writer of Proverbs, this is Agur, not Solomon here, says, remove far from me falsehood and lying. And this is what I'm after. Give me neither poverty nor riches. Feed me with the food that is needful for me. Why? Don't give me too much. Don't give me too little. Why? Lest I be full, I get too much, and I deny you. I forget you, that you are the provider and the source of everything that I have. Or say, who is the Lord? And lest I be poor and steal and profane the name of the Lord. And I wrote in the margin of that verse 30 years ago, give me enough so I don't starve and doubt your faithfulness, but don't give me too much that I'll forget you. Just help me to live no matter what circumstances are dictating to me. Just help me to live content with whatever you provide, independent of circumstances. Number 4, contentment is found when we are strengthened by God's power. When we're strengthened by God's power. There's no way on our own resources and strength that you and I can experience a life that's largely a life of contentment, probably not always a life of contentment, doing that on our own resources and our own power. It's just not possible to pull that off. And that's where he comes to verse 13, which is one of the most famous Bible passages. In fact, I know because I was here in 2014 when we remodeled the worship center. Many of you were here. And we went in one morning and wrote on the floor before we put the carpet down on the floor, all over the worship center. Many of you were part of that experience, as I was part of that experience, okay? When that was over with, some of us, I know I did, we made our way through the entire worship center, reading those, okay? You know what the most written verse or reference that was marked on that floor? Philippians 4:13. Philippians 4:13. The only problem is most of us make it say what it doesn't say. It doesn't say that I can do anything I want to because Jesus is with me. It doesn't say that. And it's a mockery to say that it does. It doesn't say that at all. Paul was in prison. And finally, this church that had so loved him and generously supported him in the rest of that second tour, they finally renew, as it were, their love for him and begin to meet his needs. But in the process, I think, going all the way back to Paul, which I think had a successful tent-making business, he got called out of that, an apostle primarily to the Gentiles, and he begins these missionary journeys that take over 10,000 miles of travel, over 3 of them, counting his trip to Rome. A lot of that by foot, some of it by sea. And Paul had learned, and that's where I think, in looking back over my experience, I didn't learn enough by life experiences early on, especially in the negative ones, that God could be trusted, that God would provide what I needed, when I needed it, in the ways that I needed. And he had so done that and so many times that I didn't even recognize that he was doing that. And I think it was in that experience, stay with me, that Paul learned that the secret of contentment was really twofold. Number 1, resting on the power of God. And that's what he's saying. I can do all things that God wants me to do through Christ. Resting not in my strength, but resting in His. But secondly, this is not specifically in the text. It's in the book of Philippians in chapter 1, chapter 4. But I think the second thing, and just stay with me here, and I think you'll see the connection. The secret to learn about contentment is learning to lean into God's power. But it's also learning to live a life of gratitude. Don't you think thankfulness and gratitude are kind of the very opposite of discontentment? And one morning for about 3 hours, I got off on a journey of Paul's writings. Paul wrote 13 letters. And 11 of them, he expressed thanksgiving for lots of different issues, people, things. 4 of those 11 books were his prison epistles. Thankfulness is mentioned 49 times in the New Testament, 30 by Paul. All in 11 of his 13 books. And we all know the story of Paul. And yet his entire journey, in spite of the difficulties, in spite of, being, beaten and imprisoned, he lived a life of gratitude. And he was able to rest in God's power. And he was able to say, I have learned how to be content. How to be content. I've learned it. Rest in God's power. When we live with gratitude, we live in contentment. This verse, let me say this before I move on to the last source. This verse is not a promise for success in any activity, but it's a promise of contentment regardless of circumstances. Don't make the text say what it doesn't say. And then last, lean, rest, reside in God's unfailing promise, especially in verse 19. My God will supply, will meet all of your, not some, all. He will, not might, all your needs, not wants, according to His riches in glory. God will supply all your needs. And by the way, I think, and I didn't get into the context of verses 14 and 19, but here's what Paul is saying. The Philippians, who were poor, had finally, reached out to him again, and Epaphroditus brought an offering out of their poverty. They had met Paul's need, and what Paul is saying is, because you met my need through your generosity, God has a promise for you that though you met my one need through your generosity, He's going to meet all of your needs because you were generous to me. So there's something in here about generosity that I think that leads to contentment as well. I just hadn't kind of figured out, all that it is, but you gave out of your poverty and God's going to meet all of your needs. And it's interesting. Let's say that I had $1 million. Okay, I had $1 million stacked up here. And I wanted to give you something. And I reached over and I pulled out $1. And I handed it to you. Okay. I gave you $1 out of my riches. Right? But was that dollar proportionate to or according to my riches? No. Now, if I reach in there and I pull out $100,000 and hand it to you, that's according to, proportionate to my riches. And that's what He has promised here. Now, had people been watching Paul's life, had people been watching the churches he had founded and their response to him in the midst of very difficult circumstances? Always. That's why this contentment is so important. Listen to what he says. Down in verse 21. Didn't even read it. Greet all the saints in Christ Jesus. The brothers who are with me send greetings. All of the saints send you greetings, especially those who belong to whose household? Friend or foe? Foe. Obviously, what had happened, God had used Paul to bear witness to Christ. He saw a harvest of Caesar's household, probably including the guards, like we saw in Philippi, in reaching the guard, the one who had imprisoned him, and the other guards, and they followed through in their baptism. And as a result, stay with me. Did those prison guards and Caesar's household know that Paul got this offering from the church? Of course they did. They would have never given it to him. They knew it. What had they witnessed? They had witnessed Paul's trust and faith in the midst of difficult circumstances, his confidence in a God that they didn't even know personally. Then they had watched people that Paul had led to faith into that same God reach out to him after 10 years and minister to his needs. And the whole world watched that. And it made a difference for the gospel. We never know who's watching, do we? But you can never go wrong being generous. You can never go wrong being grateful. Because they can bring contentment. So, here's the test. Next slide. I've looked at 5 sources of contentment. There's a 1 to 4 rating. Okay, 4 means is the highest, 1 is low. Rate yourself in each of these sources. Confidence in the providential care of God. 1, 2, 3, or 4. Trust and satisfaction in God's provision in your life right now. Realizing that your contentment is not circumstantial. Relying on His divine power, and then last on His promise, especially that His God will supply all of our needs, riches and glory. How'd you do? How'd you do? Contentment, let me close with this. Contentment is not, never has been, and never will be found in what we have or where we are. Only in who we have. Only in Him. Paul discovered that in the midst of very, very difficult circumstances. I know intellectually, I just don't always live it practically. I know that Jesus is all I need, but sometimes He's not all I want. And that bothers me. And I hope it does you. So let me go back to where we started. You remember the opening question? Who knows a discontented person? Most of you raised your hand, right? Okay. Most of you raised your hand. Here's my last question. Would that person be you? I'd like for you to stand with me if you would, please. Everybody stand. I do this every now and then, as you know. And I wrote a prayer that I like for us to read together, to pray together as a prayer of contentment. I know it's not your word, but it's still a good thing to do in 24. So join me as we pray this together. Heavenly Father, help me to be content in You, regardless of my circumstances. Help me to live in Your strength and not my own. Show me Your abundant life, provide all my needs. Help me to choose contentment and joy regardless. In Your wonderful name, amen. Thank you. Be seated. Here are a few questions for today. I don't know how much time you'll have, but on a scale of 1 to 10, I ask you to rate your level of discontentment. Share that. What are the main causes of your discontentment? Okay. how could trusting God more lessen your discontentment? If you got a word for the year, share that. And if you've got time, if you got any dreams for the 2024, share those as well. Okay? Oh, it's good to see you. Grace and peace. I love you guys. Love you guys. Love you guys.